Now for the second panel discussion on e-commerce policy landscape in India. I would request our panelists for the day to kindly come on the dais as I name them. Mr. Rajat Kathuria, Shiv Nadar University in ICRIER. Ms. Gowree Gokhale, Nitish Desai. Ms. Anita Kapur, ex-chairman CBDT. Ms. Nirupama Soundarajan, Pahle India Foundation. Mr. Ashish Aggarwal, NASSCOM. Mr. Kazim Rizvi, The Dialogue. The session will be moderated by Dr. Professor Avik Sarkar.
Thanks for joining in today, and thanks for the excellent panel in the beginning. So we talked about the overall e-commerce landscape in the first panel. In this panel, we would like to go a bit deeper into the policy aspects, and for that we will be talking a lot on policy. So without further ado, I'll first go to Ashish from NASSCOM, and like to look at your views from NASSCOM, because you have been on the industry side and as a representative of industry for a long time. Your organization represents that. How do you see the e-commerce growth story, and if you have to sustain this growth for the next 10-20 years, what do you see are the major aspects that the policy should focus on? Yes.
Thanks, Avik. And just as you're listening to the earlier session, I think the growth story is quite evident, and even when you look into the future, it's very promising. I think one of the things which industry would have expected the policy framework to really focus more on is the enabling ecosystem. By that, what I mean is that some things are quite obvious, like the entire digitalization in terms of connectivity and so on and so forth, but also stuff like local language support, because we are talking about a population which is not necessarily all transacting or wanting to transact in English. Lot of stuff which can be done at the level of state, where center and state can actually coordinate in terms of looking at logistics and saying that how can that be enabled. And in fact, there are stuff like that which there is stuff happening in bits and pieces, but if you think of an e-commerce policy, what should be the thrust of it? I think that should have been the focus, and as has been discussed in the previous session, there are laws to look at some of the stuff, because finally we are talking about commerce which is happening online, right? We are not talking about something so unique that there are no laws to deal with it. But having said that, I think when you start thinking of e-commerce, the problems and challenges get scaled up and magnified, and they also, let's say, replicate at scale. So that's where you need to then think of regulation. And I think there again, from a policy framework perspective, so not going into the specifics of individual policies, I think where there is a gap or a weakness is in our process of handling the policy development. I'll just give you a simple example. We had the 2020 consumer protection rules. They came out, and within a year of that, we went into revision of those rules. So was that backed by some evidence to demonstrate that the 2020 rules were already not working? What we had is a parliamentary committee report which pointed out to certain things. But is that sufficient as a form of evidence? Is there a data point associated with something? And then after that, we have been now engaging and deeply engaging to look at separating aspects which might relate to consumer protection and aspects which might relate to more general data protection, data management, or in fact aspects which are more about the competitive issues and tensions within the industry. And so that's the so from a design perspective, to be able to move in a structured manner to say that, okay, we have at least identified the right problems to solve, and there is enough evidence for us to be now spending our time and energy in resolving those problems. And then, of course, I think we can quickly align to say that, okay, fine, now let's fix it. So I think we have reached a stage where, despite a lot of policy uncertainty and ambiguity, the growth story continues because the sheer momentum of it. And the counterfactual we will not know. So if we had already probably put in a little more enabling framework, where would have been? So that is something that we cannot quantify. Now, and just to conclude, at least on the initial side, when we look forward, I think some of the challenges which when you think from a policy framework, are not necessarily uniquely Indian. These are global challenges. We can look at what is happening across the world. And there are definitely issues when we want to deal with, let's say from a competition aspect, that rather than waiting for something to develop in form of an ex post regulation, can we handle some of this stuff in terms of an ex ante framework? And there again, unless there is a broad agreement that what are the issues that we do really want to tackle, that should be the starting point. And I think from a global experience, roughly there are 4 areas which are therefore relevant. One is the risk around self-preferencing, the challenges around leveraging data to the detriment of, let's say, the sellers, or restricting access to data to sellers itself, and also putting barriers for switching. So some of those things, if there is a common agreement that these are challenges, and then at what scale are these problems playing out? And then probably a discussion to say that now we want to think of regulation. And this is the last point, which is again, I think we should not, there is a tendency to substitute gaps in enforcement and regulatory capacity to regulatory burden on the industry. So finally, the e-commerce industry, and when you talk about platforms, they are intermediaries. So to what extent we can expand the scope of what is due diligence and put on obligations where you say you have to prevent all violations, or you have to police the violations. I think as we speak, if you're aware, there's something called an Arms Act. The Arms Act prohibits selling of knives which are button knives. So I also didn't know that till recently. And an incident happened in NCR where a bag of such knives were found. And people who were caught, they said, we are selling it on e-commerce platform. It's prohibited, it should not be sold. It's an enforcement issue, it can be handled. But what is happening, playing out this week, is that the police is asking the founders and directors of the platform to come to the police station. So I think it is a coercive action which has a lot of implication on how the founders, the investors look at this sector. And this is just a live example I'm seeing, which is just playing out. So I think from a regulatory point of view, there is also a huge need for awareness in the regulatory ecosystem beyond the people who are well versed with the IT laws, to say that how do you treat e-commerce when you are facing a law enforcement situation. And I think these are some of the things which are worth discussing from a policy framework.
Thanks, Ashish. So this thing also reiterating the point that Anil spoke about in the last panel, that policing and regulations should be kept separate. Ma'am, I would like to come to you. You have been on the government side for a long time, and you are also now a practitioner in this area. So your views on the e-commerce growth landscape in your experience, and what are the policy actions that we can take going forward?
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be here. E-commerce is a reality, and it's going to grow. Let's take that as given. In 2014, internationally, e-commerce transactions were about, I think, 1,300 billion US dollar. We are already at 5,000 billion US dollars internationally. In India, we are around, I think, about 50 billion dollars, if I'm not incorrect. And the expectation is by 2026, we should be around $200 billion. So it's a huge marketplace that has been created. And if you look at it from the perspective of a consumer, a supplier, and the operator who's offering a marketplace. It's a win-win situation for everybody. You look at from the consumer angle, the ease of doing transaction, the variety of choice, plus the time saved. I see around me, women particularly, since I'm interested in diversity issues, those things strike me better than any other. The time being saved by a woman running a household, a young girl studying, instead of rushing to the market for daily provisions, they said everybody has access to telephone, to a mobile and internet connection, at least in tier 1, tier 2 city. Most of the people have fortunately that access. The time they get to save and the ease of transaction that they have and the kind of a credit period that they get. They don't have to rush to the baniya asking him for credit because they have fixed incomes coming at a particular time. They have credit worthiness because maybe the husband has regular source of income and the bank is willing to give him a credit card. So the consumers everywhere are benefiting. The time being saved by the youngsters can be usefully deployed in their studies or even in doing some other work which is more remunerative. I see the guards in a lot of colonies doing a side job of buying goods from these e-commerce platforms and supplying in the surrounding areas. So this is that while they are on one job and with the help of a mobile, they can order goods and on their way back home, they supply around that area. So e-commerce is not only for the elite of a society. E-commerce is benefiting consumers everywhere. Now you come to the supplier. In the earlier panel, Mr. Vinod mentioned 7,000 women being boarded on e-commerce. I thought for a country of our size, that's a very small number. Maybe we need to do some more in that area, getting more people onto this. And for there, I just wanted to flag a policy issue. There's a lot of reluctance for suppliers to come onto the board, onto e-commerce because of the GST requirement. Even if you want to sell 1,000 rupees product, you have to have a GST registration, but because if you are offline for certain amount of turnover, you don't need to be registered for GST. But if you're coming on an e-commerce platform, that facility is not available for every transaction. Even if you do small number of transactions, you have to have a GST registration. There's a composition scheme under the GST system where there's a simplified, even if you have a high turnover, there's a simplified way of doing your compliance, which is not available on the online platform. So what we need is in the regulation to recognize that you have different kind of suppliers there. And if you have different kind of suppliers, your regulations should also address their needs differently. You can't do with one stroke similar regulation for all kind of people operating on a platform. GST says, in fact, it's surprising, there's a Rajya Sabha committee report which has come out on e-commerce in June, which says DPIIT admitted before them that they don't have any data on e-commerce operators. They don't have any data of how much is the percentage of the e-commerce vis-a-vis the total GDP. And they have highlighted this lack of data. But one thing which they point out is we have more than 15,000 operators, e-commerce operators, who are registered with GST. So you have this, e-commerce, the entire ecosystem, which is going to grow, and the regulations have to keep pace with different needs of different kind of players in the market. You see these 21 rules, 2021 draft rules from the Consumer Affairs. They are targeted, if you try to understand those, they are targeted at big players, big operators and big suppliers. But if you want to enforce the same rules across the board for everybody in the marketplace, you are discouraging people from onboarding. Internationally, they have tried to find different parameters of regulation for different kind of entities operating within the system. This is another point I wanted to make. And my final point is, we are into a system where we are trying to create policy which is overlapping, and there's going to be turf war between different policy makers. You have FDI policy coming out from one wing of the government. You have consumer affairs very diligently involved into this sector. There's so much pressure on Competition Commission to address numerous issues arising out of abuse of dominance, predatory pricing, which are becoming relevant for the e-commerce. You have ED, which is supposedly currently the only authority which can look at regulatory violations which are happening through the FDI regime. You have Department of Revenue in terms of the GST compliance, and you have my earlier department, income tax, trying to enforce the digital tax in terms of equalization levy.
Yes.
So for a small entrepreneur to comply with sometimes conflicting requirements, conflicting policy prescriptions of various entities is going to be a big job. Plus, for a big player, they will always find place to fall between the stools. When you have so many regulators trying to regulate a place which is in the public eye, everybody wants to be very protective of the turf that they have. So somebody has to step in at the policy level to get everybody on one platform, and only the industry can force, because ease of business is the motto as of now of every government. And if the industry can force all the policy makers or the consumers can force the policy makers to come on one table, so that they become the facilitators rather than creating roadblock every day. Thank you.
Thanks, ma'am. Very pertinent points on the on how you see different people using e-commerce, and also that one sort of policy that might not work for all the type of sellers, because there are different strata, some small, some large sellers, some large brands, and some sort of differentiation will be helpful. And the sad part is that we do not have in-depth studies on a lot of these areas. I think collaboration between industry and academia, we can come out with many such research studies which will help in the policy making. So thanks, ma'am, for those very helpful points. Rajat, can I come over to you? You have been an expert in this domain for a long time. You are heading ICRIER for a very long time, and now you have moved to Shiv Nadar University. So how you have seen the e-commerce policy landscape evolve, and what are your suggestions for the future to sustain this sort of growth?
Thank you, Avik, and thank you, ISB, for inviting me to this already very rich discussion that has happened in the first panel and also now begun in the second panel. I'll take both a sort of a higher view than what you've asked us to do, in fact, policy prescription. So I'll take a macro view and also come down to the micro view. But everything I have to say has probably already been said, especially by Sabina in the previous session. So I'm going to sort of say that everything has to hang together. So e-commerce is one part of a huge whole that is India, demographics of 60% of the population being under the age of 30, productive jobs not having been created in India in the manufacturing sector, not doing what it was supposed to do. So, I mean, these are the things that I will try and fit together in the story I'm trying to build. But as I said, I'm not going to be able to say anything new that hasn't already been said, including what Anita ji just said about proportionate regulation, which is terribly important. So, what Anil and the previous panel talked about, the multiplier effect of the internet, Avik, that is something that we know. And that's, in fact, in India, the multiplier effect, and we at ICRIER had done a lot of that work, and I had particularly been involved in that a lot. We did the internet, the impact of mobiles, then we did the impact of internet, then we did the impact of actually data speeds as well. And the reason why impacts in India are so high at the macro level is because this was a connectivity that was happening for the first time. We did not have the fixed line connectivities that most mature markets had, almost to 100%. And our connectivity was probably abysmal when we liberalized. It was less than 1%. And then we suddenly got very high explosive numbers of 70, 80, 90% connectivity. Of course, there's a lot of duplication there. But naturally, the impacts at the macro level then turned out to be the way they were in India. The impacts were much larger than what the developed countries or the mature economies had experienced. So we got impacts of 3 to 4%, or every 10% increase in internet, or even higher for broadband. And you will see those impacts will be very high. But what do averages hide? And that's important. And I think both the narratives then become true. Whatever has been said by Vinod Kumar in the previous panel and what Sabina said in the previous panel, both of those narratives are true. It leads to a huge amount of inclusion, but it also results in a huge amount of exclusion. And that's what Joan Robinson had said about India many, many years ago. In India, what you see as true at one point in time, the exact opposite would be true at the same point in time. So the internet, while it's going to be a growth mantra for us, and I think e-commerce will be a growth mantra, one has to recognize that it will also lead to a lot of inclusion. So I'm not, like Sabina was saying, I'm not saying you shouldn't do e-commerce. I mean, I'm a big champion of digital connectivity and digital penetration. But the exclusion that will be there, as Anita ji was also saying about the SMEs and sort of proportionality, you would have to recognize that there will be a lot of inclusion. So what do you do with the people that are excluded? How are you going to address them? And here the manufacturing story, and I'm not going to push the manufacturing story too much, but manufacturing hasn't led to that takeoff that India had expected. But is e-commerce going to give you that takeoff that manufacturing provided China and South Korea and Japan earlier? I don't know. That's an open question. I don't have answers for that. But, jobs is going to be a big story for India. And e-commerce certainly cannot, by itself, it will be a part of a solution, but it cannot be the whole solution. And I think jobs is extremely important. If I just go to a little bit of history in economics, if you recall the NAFTA that was being proposed in 1992 by the Americans, the Canadians, and the Mexicans, Ross Perot, there was this single presidential candidate, and he had said, if you create this NAFTA, there'll be a giant sucking sound, and all the jobs from the United States would migrate to Mexico. We lose all the sort of jobs, or at least the low-paying manufacturing jobs. And the same question was asked to Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize winner, who's done a lot of work on trade, and he says there will be no job losses in the United States as a result of the free trade agreement. And people, began to hate and criticize economists because of that comment. All he was saying that it's the overall number of jobs will remain the same, but there'll be a lot of substitution of jobs from the lower end to the higher end as a result of creation of the free trade agreement. And I think for e-commerce, the story about e-commerce is going to be similar. There will be substitution of jobs, but overall, the numbers that Sabina talked about, overall unemployment rate, I think that 6.1% number is also sort of underestimated, because a lot of the jobs in India are less productive or are unproductive jobs, and therefore, so what I'm driving at is that e-commerce is great for our economy. Don't mistake my saying that, but we need to look for alternatives to have sort of employment. So this is the story at the meta level, Avik, at the very high level. At the sort of lower level, e-commerce, again, the policy, as you say, the policy regime has been, as in other sectors, I think the policy regime has been very volatile, and sort of there's been, sometimes you like it, sometimes you don't. Nirupama sitting next to me, and we were in ICRIER together, and the narrative at that time of e-commerce, etc., was it will kill the mom and pop stores. That was the narrative. So it was like Shakespeare saying, why Brutus, you're asking Brutus, why did you kill Caesar? He said, it's not that I loved Caesar less, but I loved Rome more. So we loved, offline jobs much more then. And we were talking about offline jobs. We loved offline jobs. And we said, we will protect offline jobs. And therefore, we will not allow e-commerce, all kinds of 30% procurement, like also Rajat in the previous panel was saying, single brand retail, etc. We did not like e-commerce at that time. Today, we love e-commerce more. And therefore, our policy is shifting towards, much more towards e-commerce, and those restrictions are being lifted. Of course, there's a learning process going on. But the point I'm making is that our policy has always been reactive. We've always reacted to, we don't have a vision of, how do you look at e-commerce? Make a vision, 15-year plan, 7-year plan, 3-year plan, and then begin to implement it, rather than doing it the other way around. We first make a 3-year plan, then we change it, and then we change it. So it's not been consistent, and it's true for all sectors as well. And telecom is a classic example of how policy keeps changing depending on the person that you are going to try and frame the policy for, whether it's for the consumer, whether it's for the corporate, or whether it's for the government itself. And there is lots of nuances there, but I won't get into the debate. And the final point, two more points, Avik. The other point is on what Anita ji had already begun to talk about, which is, how do you enforce regulation? And Ashish also mentioned ex post and ex ante regulations. And I think this is going to be a very tricky issue, because the relevant market, which is the basis on which you're going to identify competition and abuse issues, it's not going to be easy to do. You can't have one single principle for defining the relevant market. Sometimes you'll say offline and online are competitors. Sometimes you will say, there's no demand side substitutability, so look at them independently. So this is going to be an open issue, and it's best to keep it an open issue rather than ex ante trying to define what the relevant market is for enforcement. But I agree with Ashish when he says that, you have the broad principles in place. Don't lying, self-referencing, and Google has been in the dock for, self-referencing, or what, internet people call abusing search neutrality. It's certainly not neutral, and you won't expect it to be neutral. Enforcement will keep happening. It's a chicken, it's like a cat and mouse game. They will keep, Microsoft was asked to give its APIs to other developers so that they could, the smaller players could use that to develop their own applications. Did Microsoft ever reveal its APIs? I mean, in part, but never in full. So enforcement is going to be tricky, and consent, etc., for data is also going to be very tricky. So I would say that in this space, have some broad rules or broad principles, which is, exactly like Ashish said, self-referencing should not be allowed. There is, try and impose competition in the market as much as possible rather than enforcement, which will, affect innovation. And there's a very good tool that has emerged, and I'd like to do much more work on this, the ONDC. So if that enables competition to emerge, then I think you can do away with other issues or do light touch rather than come down heavily. Don't use a cannon to kill a fly. Yeah, so that's sort of proportionate regulation that Anita ji talked about. So I think be light, ex ante, based on broad principles, ex post, be flexible, define the relevant market as flexibly as possible, evaluate demand-side substitutability as you go along. So for this, you'll have to create regulatory capacity. And a final point, which is not relevant to the debate that we are having, but it is a part of the research that I'm doing currently. And I think the reason I'm tempted to make this point is because Ashish did talk about the multilingual internet, which is absolutely necessary, especially for a country like India. So if you look at the internet, who has designed it, who's the architect of it, and what's the dominant sort of standard on the internet? It's English, it's designed by Americans, it's dominated by white European and American males. I'm being provocative deliberately because this is research that I'm doing currently. But it is 75% of the internet is not designed by the people who use it, including the language. So we need to make the internet much more democratic than it actually is. In academic terms, just to use jargon, we need to decolonize the internet, and that's the sort of research that I'm doing. But what does it mean in practice? Exactly what Ashish said. We need to be able to democratize it much more, and I think language will be one way to begin to democratize the internet. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thanks, Rajat. Very, very helpful and pertinent point. I think on a similar note, I will come to Nirupama. She has spent a long time working on this area of retail and now working on e-commerce. The reports that she has worked in the past talked about the fears from the policy aspects about malls and supermarkets coming in and disrupting the mom and pop stores. And now e-commerce has bringing in similar fears. I'd like to hear from your perspective what you have seen this evolution over the last 20 years, and what do you see commonalities between the setting up of the single brand, the supermarkets, and now what you see in e-commerce space.
Thanks, Avik. As you mentioned, I've been working on retail for quite some time, and as Rajat mentioned too, from the time in ICRIER. I think the narrative has been pretty much similar irrespective of what format comes in. Much like what Rajat said, we were used to your traditional formats of retail, so anytime anything new came in, you immediately became wary of it. At that time, it was your organized retail, the big malls and all of them, and today it is e-commerce, and tomorrow it will be your meta stores and all of them as well. So as we become used to one format and another format comes in, we'll get cagey all over again and start looking at it from the point of view of how to regulate and how to literally impede growth in most cases. In the interest of protecting, as Rajat said, your offline jobs, which may then obviously increase to online jobs to some extent, and and the process continues. I have always maintained when it comes to retail that we need a single policy for retail. The essence of retail is basically the act of selling goods or services to a consumer, between a business and a consumer, and that's the B2C side. You also have your B2B side, but whichever way it is just a transaction. Now, in an ideal setup, and like it is in most economies, you don't need to differentiate between offline, online, offline selling online probably setting up offline stores, or between direct selling. I mean, you have multiple formats. The format shouldn't matter. At the heart of retail, what is it from a regulation point of view or from a policy point of view? I believe there are some principles that we need to make sure that we regulate. Customer protection is one. At the heart of it, you want to make sure that if you're getting into a transaction, it is done well and the customer is protected and has recourse to grievance redressal, etc., etc. In today's day and age, that has developed further to include competition was always one, that there are no unfair trade practices that come in, whether it's offline, online, whichever format. In today's age, it is about data protection, how you're accessing. So these are the large principles. And in effect, when you are regulating these principles, I don't see why they need to be different for offline and online or any other format that comes in, because the outcome of what these regulations should be the same irrespective of the format. And somewhere in the larger framework of our regulatory, larger picture of our regulatory framework, we seem to have forgotten that. Which is why we have differentiated regulations based on formats. I think Rajat in the earlier panel had mentioned about offline retailers now selling online. Now, look at the regulatory arbitrage that we've created. Now, we have said that if you have FDI coming into the country, they can come in only in a marketplace model, which means they are not allowed to hold inventory. However, you have allowed single brand retail, which are foreign retailers, to sell online, which means they are holding inventory. Now, what is the sense in that? What are we trying to look at here? It doesn't make sense clearly, but I don't see why this isn't obvious to the policymakers sitting there and why we're creating these divides. Because the more regulations we create based on formats and on origin of, and differentiations based on origin of capital and formats, the more loopholes you will have. And as Anita ji said, you will find the larger players trying to, kind of squeeze in between and kind of fall through and not really place one on the, place the blame from one place to another. The second problem with always having multiple regulators looking at every aspect of retail is there is invariably going to be an overreach. Now, when the 2021 guidelines came out under consumer protection, one of the biggest criticisms against those, the e-commerce policy, was that it was severe overreach. Not only were they trying to look at it from the point of view of what business, how they should be conducting business, while instead of looking at only the consumer protection area, but the Consumer Protection Act was also looking at B2B businesses, which doesn't fall under its domain at all. So where do you draw the line? Which is why I always believe that it's best to have a single retail policy, which means that you define what your principles of regulation are going to be, what you're going to be regulating, and then lay those down for retail as a whole, instead of getting into specifics saying, are you an offline retailer who's also selling online? Are you an online retailer who maybe wants to set up an offline? It doesn't matter. That's the one big large point in terms of regulatory framework that I'm saying. The second point is, today again, when we talk of e-commerce, by default, in our heads, we always refer to only as marketplaces, because the narrative has largely been about the bigger players, irrespective of whether they're domestic or foreign. But e-commerce is not just that. E-commerce is also the smaller businesses, standalone stores who have their own websites who are selling, maybe cross-border or maybe within the country. Now, do the regulations actually address them? They may not be necessarily small people in terms of turnovers, but they are small from the point of view of operations. It's a single store probably handled by, and they have their business. Now, why is it that this definition or this part of e-commerce doesn't feature in our everyday discussions when we're talking of a regulatory framework? So on the one hand, while as we should be concerned about involving MSMEs and getting them on board and all of that, but sometimes we forget that the policy cannot just look at or cannot be created keeping in mind the larger people, domestic or foreign. And in this country, I think currently with the e-commerce platforms, it's largely been targeted at foreign e-commerce players in the country, because you can see a severe arbitrage between domestic and foreign as well. And we seem to forget that there are an entire lot of businesses which also tend to sell online. The last point I want to make is and I think what Anita ji already made, was the difference is that it is not a cogent approach at all. You have multiple people coming out with it, and in the interest of, as you say, policing, which has been made again and again, it acts detrimental to the larger interest. Now recently CBIC has also jumped onto the e-commerce bandwagon when they issued their guidelines for how the gems and jewelry industry can use e-commerce for exports. Now they've gotten in, and under the courier regulations and under these, you have a whole set of guidelines that they've said as to what needs to happen. And part of these, Now, what happens is, now while they have issued these guidelines keeping in mind the gems and jewelry sector and suggested amendments and made amendments to courier regulation, now because of these, because you've made it keeping in mind only one sector, it's going to actually have a huge negative impact on e-commerce which is outside of that sector, because you've suddenly increased your regulatory burden for other sectors as well. So the fact of the matter is, we're going to come out with regulations. We need to keep in mind that you're not doing it for a particular sector, you're not doing it for a particular format, it has to be wholesome. So I will conclude by saying that if today we want to actually take this forward in terms of creating an enabling environment, because at the end of the day, a regulator and regulations have a dual responsibility of enforcement, regulation and market development. And in the entire span of things, and it's common with many sectors, but particularly I think in the retail sector, the market development element has been left out completely. It has largely been regulation and enforcement. And I think that is what we need to keep in mind. There has to be a vision, and the vision has to be in creating a uniform retail policy which is agnostic of source of capital, origin of capital, and agnostic of format. And you look at it in that sense and create it, where in its heart and in its principle, in its heart you are looking at consumer protection, better business practices, fair business practices, and with data protection, privacy, all of that in place. And as we evolve, we look at that, because with the metaverse now emerging, you're going to get a completely new brand. So we need to create policy which is forward looking and which takes into account the fact that it is an evolving sector. We need to do that. And we need to make sure that it is more collective, representative in terms of minimizing exclusions as much as we can. So differentiated regulations probably. So we need to look at that. And finally, I think the most important of them all is you need to have one agency which does the overarching frameworks and the rest kind of fitting into them. Everybody wanting a piece of the pie of e-commerce regulation, I don't think is going to work. So we need a more cogent approach. I'll stop at that.
Yes, thanks Nirupama. I think we come back to the same point of policies and regulations as an enabler and not for policing. The aspect of one department or ministry is not in e-commerce, is the story with many other topics. I work on AI, data, like there is multiple people who wants to own it. So that is a challenge with the government setup. I think we need bigger restructuring to take care of those aspects. So Kazim, you have in the last 3 years worked a lot on all aspects of e-commerce policy through dialogue. I would like to get your view on what you see as the future of regulation in e-commerce, and this will be nice to do this in the interest of time.
Thank you, Dr. Sarkar. I think a lot of the points which I was thinking of speaking have already been discussed in detail. So I think what I'd like to focus a little bit is on the future evolution of e-commerce policy and whether we need a policy or not and how it should be conceived and what are the sort of broad frameworks and principles which the policy should focus at. So I think first of all, when we talk about regulation and regulation of any sector or any economy, I think the primary reason why we look at it is there a market failure or not, right? And when we look at e-commerce, e-commerce is not a standalone sector. It's part of the larger internet and tech economy. And so a lot of the aspects and a lot of the things which operate within the sector are also part of the larger internet economy. So when we regulate and we want to regulate e-commerce, we have to look at regulating it from a risk-based approach. We have to regulate the risks which pertain within the e-commerce sector rather than regulating, let's say, certain aspects of it. And what are the risks when we talk about on e-commerce? I think one of the things which has been spoken a lot is on consumer protection, right? So that's something which is important. The second is around data privacy. Of course, security is critical. Then at the same time, we have to make sure that you provide an enabling atmosphere ecosystem for all the players to survive, a more level playing field. And I think we also have to look at business growth, continuity, and taxation. So these are some of the key aspects which have to be regulated to help the larger growth of e-commerce sector from end to end. I mean, from the moment somebody goes online and tries to purchase a product to the moment that product is delivered to his or own place. But what we are seeing is that a lot of the regulations and a lot of the attempt over the last few years have been overlapping in nature. and are also not synchronized and harmonized in nature. So for example, the consumer protection rules which came out last year, while great in intent and theory, they try to look at competition issues or data issues, which are already being discussed through other mechanisms by different regulators. So number one, how can we arrive at a more greater regulatory harmonization and synchronization between different regulators, which are trying to address some of the risks associated within the larger tech economy, of which e-commerce is a part of. I think that's the kind of regulation we have to look at. Number two. Number three, I think what we also have to understand is, going forward, if we are sort of creating a policy, do we need a broader policy, or do we need to sort of first look at existing rules and regulations, which we have to try to amend? Number one. Number two, also improve enforcement of existing rules and regulations, so that if we are coming up with an overarching policy, that policy is more of a guideline rather than an enforcing mechanism, because it's a regulatory job to enforce something. It's not a policy job to enforce something. So that's something also from an administrative point of view we have to be very careful of when we look at a policy discourse and a larger policy regulation of e-commerce. And what we are seeing is a lot of overlaps, as were rightly discussed. So how do we arrive at a place where different pillars of e-commerce chain are being regulated, are being enforced by the existing regulators? So when we talk about payments, the RBI is the nodal body, and it's RBI's job to ensure that payment security is standardized, etc. Now, do you need an overall policy to look into payments as well? Now again, we move to data, and data privacy issues are already being looked at by a data protection bill. There will be a DPA which will come into place. Now, how will that DPA work with the e-commerce players? That role is up to the DPA to decide. So do you need an overall policy where there's a different regulator to regulate e-commerce data? Right? So that brings a lot of confusion. So I think what we need is sectoral regulators. We have to strengthen the sectoral regulators, number one. We have to make sure that sectoral regulators are more harmonized and in sync with each other. And this is something which was actually brought up by the Parliamentary Standing Committee report, which ma'am sort of spoke about previously, that there is not much synchronization between the ministries and regulators in the government when it comes to e-commerce regulation. So if we can strengthen that first, rather than looking at another policy framework to then regulate and to sort of talk about different aspects of e-commerce and then bring in more confusion. Because what we've seen in the last few years is there is an attempt, but then it has been taken back. I mean, the draft rules have not been implemented, primarily because of the fact that there are a lot of overlapping issues and synchronization issues which have not been met, right? Now, if you look at competition per se, CCI is already working on it, and CCI is looking at collecting evidence. There have been a lot of discussions going on, and CCI is doing its job. So do you need another body to look into it? Do you need an overall policy framework to look into it? Or can you have a policy framework which is more prescriptive in nature, which looks at these issues, but then connects it with different sectoral regulators, and then let the regulators work with each other. Let there be MOUs between the regulators, let there be some sort of agreement between the regulators, so that there's more synchronization between the enforcement of the risk and enforcement of the policies which are already in place. I think that's something which is something which we are also working on, and I sort of wanted to pay a lot of emphasis on that, because I think in the future, the question will not be whether we should have a policy or not. The question will be, how do we bring together what we already have and enforce it in a way that it works for the benefit of the sector, addresses the risk, regulates the problems, and then once we have achieved that harmonization, then we look at a policy which improves it further, looking at the emerging technologies like metaverse, etc., which will create a lot more challenges going forward, and of course a lot more opportunities as well. And how do we bind that all together is how we should look at the future as well for e-commerce.
Thanks, Kazim. That's very helpful point. I think we see a lot of commonality in the discussion on simplification, coordination within the ministries, enabling a regulatory, creating an enabling framework for growth of SMEs and small industries. I think on that note, I would like to call and closure to this panel. I think the panelists will be available for discussion after the next session. And in the interest of time, we'll go on to the next session. So thanks everyone for your very pertinent points and very valuable insights.